this mask is just a little bit too thin. I would want to add flaps to the side, maybe a little padding.
Duct tape.
Here's a profile photo of our beast mask in action. What we'll do now is we'll look at the structures that make up this mask. You'll see that each part is easy to make and comes together really well, and it'll also give you an understanding of how the whole mask is constructed before we go into the specific how-tos. The whole mask relies on a craft store purchased masquerade mask made of stiffened fabric. The masquerade mask is already shaped to hug your brow and cheeks, and it gives a nice rigid base for the rest of the mask to be built off of. If a masquerade mask is not available to you, you can construct something similar out of foam, but it won't have the same rigidity, and the rigidity is really important, as the whole rest of the mask depends on it. It can also be reinforced with extra elastic around the back of the head to hold the mask more firmly if you're going to be doing a lot of action shots. If you have a specific actor in mind, you'll probably have to widen and cut the eye holes a little differently to match them. If you don't have a specific actor in mind, you can just use the generic eye placement in the mask, and then adjust how the mask sits on the face by gluing foam pads to the inside of the masquerade mask before you shoot your film. Hot glued directly to the masquerade mask is going to be our upper jaw. The upper jaw will be constructed out of thermoformed fun foam, and because it's glued to the cheeks and the bridge of the nose of the masquerade mask, it'll capture every little movement of the actor's head. This allows for subtle head tilts and turns and things like that, something that you won't get if you use a mascot type head for your costume. The bottom jaw rests firmly against the actor's jawline. The angle the bottom jaw sits at is determined by the thickness of padding placed under the actor's chin. That padding could be made up of layers of fun foam that are glued together, or a hacked up piece of old furniture foam. The bottom jaw of the mask is held snugly in place with an elastic band that goes over the head of the actor. The band can also be clipped in place with bobby pins or barrettes to keep the elastic from sliding. By being firm against the chin and jawline, it allows for the maximum translation of movement from the actor's jaw to the mask's jaw. Glued to the masquerade mask and the sides of the upper jaw are fur flaps. The faux fur flaps cover the wearer's features, like their ears, their hairline, and can be formed over padding to give specific shapes, like a heavy brow. The fur flaps on the side of the face hide the intersection of the upper and lower jaw, so we don't have to get crazy and come up with some sort of elastic mechanism where the two meet. Additional elastic may be added to the flaps covering the ears to hold the flaps in place around the head and add extra security to the whole mask. And also, you could attach a flap over the back of the head, attach a wig, or anything you want glued to the top and side flaps. This unusual configuration of flaps allows you to use the actor's hair as the beast's hair. Might I suggest Afro werewolf, anyone? The chin flaps adhere to the side flaps and are drawn together at the bottom with a piece of Velcro. They obscure the line of the jaw and hide the corner of the mouth of the mask. And because they have the Velcro, they can be undone, and then the whole top part of the mask can be slid off without interfering with the bottom jaw. And finally, the accessories will be added to the finished pieces of the mask, such as teeth, eyes, nose, ears, tongue, and I'll go over different possibilities for each of these accessories in the how-to sections. Now that you understand the structure of the mask, I'll show you how to make each section. When selecting craft foam, you'll if you're at a good craft store, you'll have a difference in thickness, let's see, 3mm versus I think 5mm, color, and size. Some stores will actually sell huge rolls that are several feet wide, though you often have to special order those off the internet. If you're at a store like Walmart where they don't carry a variety of foams, you can cannibalize a door hanger kit to get thick foam for special applications. So what I'll do for this video is I'm going to purchase some thick red foam and some thick black foam, as well as several sheets of thin foam to make the base of the mask out of. The foam is what's going to give our mask a lightweight structure that's still very durable and pretty stable. It's a great alternative to many of the plastics, meshes, or other structures you see to support a mask. Selecting elastic isn't very difficult. You can either buy it pre-packaged, or you can buy it off the roll. If you're buying it off the roll like this, get the idea of how much elastic you want, and then take it to the cutting counter and ask them to cut you however many feet or out of your yard you need. Elastic comes in a lot of varieties, like this really thick stuff, this medium stuff, or this thin stuff. The really thin elastic won't have the kind of grip that we need for this project to hold the mask to a face. The thick elastic looks appealing because you'd think it would have a good grip, but it doesn't quite have enough stretch, and it can be problematic to adhere because there's going to be a lot of resistance from the elastic. It could end up tearing the foam on the mask. By going with this medium width elastic, we're going to get the best for our needs. As a base to build our mask off of, we're going to be looking at these craft store masquerade masks. You could build a base out of foam or other material, but I like these because they're very stiff, as long as they're made of compressed fabric with glue. Now see these? These are really heavy. They're not made of plastic, they're made of a fabric. And if you compare them to the plastic ones, hot glue will simply melt through this plastic. You're going to want something thicker and heavier. If you don't have access to something like this, or you can't find them, or whatever, you can make your own mask out of shaped foam. So some elements of working with foam are really straightforward. If we cut out a shape like an ear out of a piece of foam, that's not too hard. But this ear looks kind of crappy. If we just stick it on the mask, it has some shape to it, but it doesn't have a lot of personality, and it doesn't look organic. What we can do is we can use heat to shape that same piece of foam, to form it into something that looks a lot more like the shape we're after. Thermoforming can be used, heat shaping can be used to shape your upper and lower jaws, your ears, anything that you want to make out of the foam. It also allows you to get really neat structures, like dome shapes, without using a lot of extra foam and glue and making more weight for yourself. So now I'll show you how to do heat shaping with a piece of scrap foam. So here we have our very hot water. I just pulled it off from the stove where it was boiling, and a piece of scrap foam. Cold water, hot water. So dip it in, let it get soft for a few seconds, and then shape it. Place it in cold water to set that shape, and there you go. If you want to make an extreme shape, you'll probably have to go through several shapings. It can also help to reinforce tight folds or corners by going in over and over again. So we can take a piece of flat foam and really do some crazy things to it, and it will hold its shape when it's done.
Here is the shape cut out of foam for the upper jaw. It doesn't matter quite how you cut it, as long as it folds up to form the shape that you'll need for the upper jaw. To get an idea of the length and width you want, take your mask and just set the jaw on it. The character mask we're making has a long, thin snout, so this will be fine. And if I want to have any peculiar curves or bumps, I can heat form those on. This is the shape I'm using for the lower jaw. Notice it's got a nice big arc to make room for the neck of the wearer. These will go on the cheeks around the jawline of our actor. And here's just where it folds in and glues on itself. Heat forming the foam will hold it in this shape. So I'll heat form the upper and lower jaw, then glue them. So now I've heat formed the lower and the upper jaw, and it's time to make them fit together. Now I've made sure that they fit inside each other, but to make sure that they'll sit on the face in such a way that they meet perfectly, what I'll do is I'll mount the upper jaw onto the masquerade mask, and then place the lower jaw and the masquerade mask on my actor, or on myself if I don't have an actor to fit it to. Now to make this fit, I may have to cut away a little extra foam. It looks pretty decent. And gluing is really simple. Just apply the glue to the foam, and then apply the foam to the mask. And then hold till it's cooled. I almost forgot. You can't wear the bottom jaw to test it out until you've got some elastic on it. But because the 3mm foam is so thin, the pressure of the elastic pulling on it through a hole will rip it. And because the elastic, when in use, is constantly stretching and moving, you can't glue it on because it will simply loosen itself from the glue and fall off. So what I've done is I've reinforced the side of a hole in the jaw with a piece of thick foam, and you could do that with a couple pieces of thin foam too, and then tied the elastic through. So, take a piece, cut a couple slits in it, turn it the other way, cut a couple slits in it, and you have your hole. Flip over the jaw. Do the same thing. The other side. And then apply glue to my thick reinforcing piece. And again, whenever you glue, hold the piece in place for a little longer than you think is necessary because, again, the foam will insulate the glue and keep it warm. Now, once the upper and lower jaw are being tried on, if the lower jaw sticks out too much, trim in here. If the upper jaw sticks out too much, you have a couple options. You can rip the upper jaw off the mask, trim it, and then re-glue, or you can pull these tabs apart, cut them in deeper, and then refold it. So I'll go adjust mine, and then we'll go on to the next step.
Recording.
Now, before you add fur, anything that needs to be as a layer under the fur has to be added now. So, I want to have, say, some bumps in the forehead, like some heavy eyebrows. Add the foam now. The reason there's eyes in here, even though I'm going to cover eyes later, is that this kind of eye that you make yourself at home has to be mounted now. All the other eye options I give you, you don't have to worry about until the mask is almost completed. In order to mount these eyes, you simply put your mask on your actor or yourself, line up the pupil so that you can see through it, and add a dot of glue to the top of the eye, then press it in place. Do that for both eyes, then go in and fill the cracks around the mask so that the eye adheres. Okay, so on to the next chapter, adding the fur. The selection of fabric can be daunting for someone who's not used to sewing or buying these sort of products. A lot of the fur that you find, if it's outside of Halloween, is going to be very cheaply made. You can see this long white fur is attractive because it's so long and it's got varying hair lengths, but it's very, very thin. I don't know if you can see it, but my fingers are making a silhouette through the fur, and that's not going to be what you want for a mask application. Darker fur with a darker backing will help, but again, because it's just a thin, long fur, it may not have the effect you want. But if you want to try it, or if that's what you're going for, great. These heavy woolly furs or fleeces might not be what you want, because they're not going to look like an animal texture. They're just going to look thick, like a pair of old pajama pants. How the fur looks on the bolt, which is what these are called, is how it's going to look on your mask. So make your selection carefully. And also realize that if you trim your fur to length, it may have different colors at different lengths. For example, expensive furs will have long hairs that are one color, and then a second layer of fur underneath that's a different color. And if you trim your mask, you'll end up with a white mask with gray spots wherever you've cut it short. So make sure you pay attention to the qualities of your fur. When you buy fabric off the bolt, you're going to buy it by the yard. And when you buy a yard of fabric, it's not one square yard. It's a length from the end of the fabric down the bolt of whatever you ask for. So if I ask for 2 yards of fabric,
So I think I want it off, so please.
this will be unfolded to its full size, measured 2 yards from this spot, and then cut straight. Fake fur swatches are an alternative if you don't have access to a fabric store, or if you don't want to buy fur online, or if the fabric store has a terrible selection. It's the same as the fur you can buy on the bolts, only it comes in a smaller amount, usually 9 by 12 inch sheets. You can get in a variety of colors, as well as different lengths and quality. For example, this is the deluxe fur. The difference between the deluxe and the normal craft fur is this has a thicker pile, so it has more hairs per square inch, and it has a nicer texture to it. For our purposes, the plain craft fur will work fine. Because it's got such long hair and such a thick pile, when you glue 2 pieces together, you won't see a seam. So you can buy several craft fur swatches and glue them together and it'll look fine, as opposed to using one large piece of fake fur that you've purchased from a bolt. For the project like the mask we're making, we'd probably need to buy 2, maybe 3 of these swatches. Gluing the fur to the foam is easy. If you're not sure how much fur you'll need to use for an application, just line the fur up, glue it, and then cut after the gluing's done, as I'm doing with the lower jaw. Because the sides of the jaw are going to be concealed within the mask, I don't think I need to put fur over every single surface. So I'll start the fur where the line of glue is. Okay, line it up, press, roll, press, roll, and now I cut. There's a couple ways to cut the fur. One way is to make a small snip and then tear. That'll give you a nice straight cut that preserves the fur. If you cut with shears or scissors, you'll get a jagged edge with an uneven layer of fur where it's been snipped in half. However, since I've got an unusual shape, I'll have to go through and cut with the scissors. I'll leave a little extra, and when I cut, I try to get down to the base of the weave here, so I don't trim the fur any more than I have to. Okay, so we'll come back to this after I've done a little cutting. These scissors are really dull. So now that I have the fur cut out, I have to glue it to the front of the jaw. So here's where we're going to talk about fur direction. Obviously I want the fur looking like it's growing away from the jaw and towards the chin, so I've lined it up that way. But what about this seam? There's a couple ways I could do this. I could cut out a slice in the middle and fold it together like that and glue it. But then I'd get fur going in opposite directions, and the fur wouldn't hide the seam. So what I'll do instead is I'll fold it up towards the top of the jaw, glue it in place, and then either cut away or fold back and glue these sections, allowing for a nice fuzzy chin and hiding the seams. By being aware of the fur direction as you're working, you'll be able to avoid any sort of ugly seams when the hair moves in different directions at the location of the seam. So now I have that little fold to deal with I was talking about, making the two folds at the sides and bringing them into the side of the muzzle. So I'm going to show you how to go about gluing on top of the fur, not the bottom. You want to make sure you've got the glue right where you want your fold to be, because we don't want the glue peeking out through the fur at any point. You're going to want to add a nice thick dab, and then quickly pull the gun away so it doesn't leave a string, and then fold. Don't mush it around because the glue will end up coming through the hair and doing all sorts of awful things. Just hold it in place. If I push too hard, the glue may actually work its way through the mesh, through the fur, and show up over the surface. So just holding. I want to wait till it's almost entirely cool because there's a lot of pressure on the glue at this part. And if it's still warm, it'll peel the softened glue away. And it's cooling down somewhat. There we go. And so I'll do the same thing to the other side. Isn't that nice? You can't tell there's a seam there, can you? So now that the chin is glued in place, it's time to make the fur match the edge. So I know exactly where I'm going to cut. So what I'm doing is I'm brushing the fur so that it lays in a direction perpendicular to the cut. This way, as I cut, as much fur as possible will be left on the backing. If I brush it this way, and I cut, I'll go through and I'll trim off the fur from down here. So again, paying attention to the direction of the fur is very important. So brush that out of the way. And with a sharper pair of scissors now, I can go through and cut it right to the edge. So I'll go through and do this now for the whole mask, or the whole lower jaw. Now that the edge of the fur has been cut to match the edge of the foam, I'm going to glue it in place. I'm going to add only a little bit of glue and spread it kind of thin because I don't want glue sticking up over my seam, which is really hard to avoid, but I also don't want a big thick lump in the fur where there's a huge pile of hot glue underneath. So once the fur is glued along the edge of the jaw, you have a couple of design choices. You can leave it as is. You can use paint to camouflage where the two areas meet by painting it black or painting it brown. Or you could add a lip. For the demonstration, I'm going to add a lip. I've cut the side of a sheet of fun foam off, pretty thickly, pretty wide, about an inch. And what I'll do is I'll glue it on the front, fold it over, glue it into the foam, and go around and form a lip. I'll show you how that lip looks in a second. So here's one of the lips already finished. Well, half a lip at least. Now I'll show you how to do this. I started by placing glue in a thin layer in about an inch wide patch, folded it over, and held it in place until it was cool for about 30 seconds. This is a slow process. Then fold the lip up, apply some glue, wipe it around so it's really thin in about an inch wide patch. Follow the fold, stretch and bend it, then hold until it's cool. And you do this over and over and over again. You get the idea. Alright, I'll keep holding this while it cools and cut to the next section. So how to fix mistakes with hot glue. Horror of horrors. There's some glue that's spilled out from the edge of the lip. Well, either the glue can be ripped away, taking the fur with it, or it can be camouflaged. I've cut some extra fur off another piece of the faux fur swatch. I then take my glue gun, clean off the nozzle with a piece of fun foam so it doesn't have any glue residue on it, reheat the spilled glue so it's nice and melted, and stick my fur on. Problem? What problem? I don't see a problem. If you've left a gap in the lip, or at any point in this process you leave a gap in the fur between two pieces of foam, easy to fix. Take the nozzle of your glue gun, wipe it off with a piece of fun foam so there's no glue residue left. Peel back the area that's loose, stick the tube of the gun all the way in, apply just a little touch of glue, and then hold and press. Let it cool as much as possible. And there you go. The hole is closed. Adding fur to the mask is a bottom-up process. We begin with the back layer and then work forward to layers on top. So I'm going to start off with a dome covering the forehead and the top of the actor's head. To do that, I've drawn a slightly round shape on the fabric, and I've put two lines here. What I'll do is I'll put a cut on those lines and then bring this part over this part and then this part over this part and glue to create a dome shape. Let me show you what that looks like. When gluing the two sides, make sure you do it in the same way. So if in this side the outer flap goes under the middle flap, make sure the same thing happens on the other side, or else you'll have a real messed up looking distribution of hair on the front. Okay, I'll do the same thing. as before. The outer flap goes under the middle flap. And now I have a nice round dome that's going to go from the top of the mask over the actor's forehead to the top of the actor's head. Attaching the dome to the top of the mask is as straightforward as it was to attach the fur to the bottom of the jaw. These folds were added because the craft fur was folded on itself and stapled. They should go away when I trim it later on. If they don't, there's a couple ways I can get around it. I can just brush the fur until it lies flat. I can heat it a little and bend the area out, or I can glue more fur over it. To fit the fabric to the upper jaw of the piece, I'm going to take one of my scraps, make sure the fur is going in the direction I want it to go on the mask. Okay. Then just lay my scrap over the top. I'm lining up the edge of the fur with the edge of the foam right now. And then that lets me know where I have to cut it. You can keep a marker handy with you and mark where you need to cut it, but in my case I know the idea, so I'll just go and trim it. Now I've cut my piece of fabric to the length I need. I'm keeping in mind that I've got the hair in the right direction. Lining up to check. Yes, it looks terrible. Pretty much everything will look terrible until you trim the fur. Don't worry too much about that. And just as I did the lower jaw, I'll glue the upper jaw. Because there's so much area to cover, I'm gluing half at a time rather than trying to get it all done at once. Okay. Press, press. I'm not pulling the fur tight, I'm just letting it rest on the surface. If the fur is glued in very tight, it may end up warping the foam underneath because the fur won't have any give, but the foam will. So I've also glued the other side, and now I've left only a little bit of slack. How much extra fabric you leave to work with, again, is a design choice. Maybe you're not going to have a nose. Maybe you're just going to have a big furry lump. So you want a big extra flap to wrap all the way under the lip. In this case, I've cut a little hair lip sort of shape out of the foam, and I've left just enough extra so that it'll look like the lip is going up towards where I'll glue the nose on. So I'll glue that in place. Then onto the flaps. So here's a 3/4 view of the mask with the nose, right eye, left eye, top of the head. Before we can go and do the details around the eyes and the brow and all that, we have to put on the fur that's going to attach over here. And that brings us to the flaps. There are going to be 2 flaps per side. One flap attaches to the side of the head and will wrap around the actor's head, covering their ear and their hairline. The other flap will attach at an angle down here and cover where the bottom jaw meets the actor's chin. The 2 angled bottom flaps will meet together with a Velcro closure. Velcro is easy to use. You can just hot glue it in place and you don't even have to buy new stuff. You could cannibalize some Velcro off an old pair of pants or something. So now I'll put the flaps on the mask, then do the other details, such as the fur around the eyes and the other lip. Here's 2 flaps glued on. To hide the fact that there's hair meeting in different directions, I brushed the forehead hair up at an angle, glued this on top, and then brushed the hair back down. So it gives it more of a sweeping curve in the way the hair grows. Okay, I'll do the flaps on the other side. Now I'm on the end of my 3rd swatch of craft fur. I've used 3 swatches that were 9 by 12 inches, which means I've used 1/4 of a yard. So this is a really, really tight use of fur. So for furring my ears, I'm putting scraps together. Remember from the beginning, when you purchase this stuff, the long pile hides seams very well. To reuse loose hair, simply wipe your surface and gather the loose hair into a clump. And then pull it and stack it. In doing this, all of the hairs will line up in the same direction, giving you a nice usable tuft of kind of crepe hair. So now I can take this and I can put fuzz inside the ears, cover a mistake, or maybe extend the hair by gluing it onto the ends of existing hairs. So here you can compare the cut side, where I've glued a small flap to the top and bottom of the eye, to the uncut area. I've brought a little of the fur in here, but otherwise it's the way it was when I started. See how by leaving some areas long and shaping them, you can get a lot of personality. It almost looks like an eyebrow, makes them angry looking. And then by leaving the flap sticking out here long, it gives the illusion of more shape to the mask than there is. Notice that at the edge of the jaw, I've left the hair long. The fake fur is going to obscure where the bottom and top jaw meet. So now I'll trim up the other side, glue the flaps on, and we'll go to the next step. The trick to trimming fake fur is to have it all poofed up, as straight as it will stick out from the mesh backing that's on the fur, and then go through and make lots of little snips. Lots of little snips will lead to a smooth surface with no gaps. It doesn't look like it's been cut. But if we leave the fur straight and don't poof it up, then cut it, you can very obviously tell that the fur has been trimmed with scissors. That can be great if you're trying to create a certain edged look, but unless you want a line in your fur, make sure you poof it up before cutting. To blend the mesh backing of the hair in with the foam, I've just taken the end of a Q-tip, or generic cotton swab, and dipped it in acrylic paint. I use dabbing motions like I was painting with a sponge to work it into the foam and into the mesh. I don't add a lot to the Q-tip with each go because I don't want a lot of paint on the area. I just want a little bit of paint right at the edge. So now I'm adding more paint and coming back in. So you can see that works very well. And if I've got a mask that I'm going to be using for a lot of close-up shots, I'll actually peel the fur back and get in there. I wouldn't be this detailed if this was for a stage play or for just far away creepy effects. But if it's going to get a lot of camera time up close, definitely get all the little edges. Okay. So here I am painting the trim chin. I've just worked some paint onto a piece of paper, dried out my brush a bit, and using that dry brush, I can go through and apply paint to the chin. Because I'm applying white paint, it has to go on really thick to be seen, so I'll have to go through and comb this smooth after the paint's been applied, whereas with darker colors, I can just dry brush the paint on. See? Not that hard. I'll go through and comb it, and it'll look really great. And combing right after application of the paint keeps the hair soft and separate rather than allowing the paint to glue it all together. To finish off the fur part of the mask, we need to decide how we're going to have elastic holding these flaps to the sides of the actor's head. If I put the elastic down here, these ears will be heavy and they'll hang forward, which could be cute if you want a little bouncing, wolfy sort of look. But I want the ears to be straight up and pressed against the side of the head. So what I'll do is the points where I attach the elastic will be where the back of the ear meets the edge of the flap. I'll do that on both sides, and then the elastic will hold the ears like that.
The easiest thing to do for the eyes of a mask is to leave a hole and let your actor's natural eye peek out. But if their natural eye color doesn't match your needs for the costume, you can look at color contacts. On the left-hand side, I show color-enhancing contacts. You can go to an eye doctor's office, get a prescription, and even if you don't need a correction for your eyesight, you can buy a pair of these. They have subtle color on the iris to bring out the natural color in your eye, but if you mismatch colors, you can get some extreme effects like the ones you see here. On the right-hand side, you see special effects contacts. Again, you have to get a prescription in the US, but I've included these photos, which are from an amateur costumer on a forum. She's let me use them with permission. It shows how not perfect they can be. You can see the green contact lens has begun slipping, looking kind of funky there and obscuring the wearer's vision. And then the slit-eyed contact has begun tipping because it's not heavily weighted at the bottom. So instead of getting a cool lizard look, you'll get snake with brain trauma. Those who know a bit about this topic will realize I have left out scleral lenses. Scleral lenses rest on the white of the eye, as opposed to corneal lenses that just rest around the cornea, the middle of the eye. Scleral lenses can be difficult. They're a topic way outside of this, and I don't suggest trying them unless you've got a lot of resources to put into a project, because you're definitely going to want an eye doctor alongside you during that process. As an alternative to contacts or making your own eyes, you can buy lenses or harvest lenses from toys and things like that. I've seen folks do interesting things with half of a clear plastic dome a toy has come in. These little lenses here are Sunset's brand protective tanning eyewear. There's a lot of different options for eyes that aren't contact lenses that look really good. This is the plastic sheet I'm going to use to make my eye lenses. The kind of plastic I'm using is called polycarbonate. You can also use acrylic. They're sold under different brand names. The acrylic sheets could be called Lexan or plexiglass, but as long as it's a sheet about pretty thin, like I'm using 1/8 inch, that comes covered in a protective layer on both sides, it's going to be the right kind of stuff to use. When cutting it, leave the protective layer on. It'll keep it from getting scratched. I'm cutting on a sheet of fun foam because I don't have a wood workbench. I'm just using it as a non-slip surface. It has nothing to do with cutting. To start with my lenses, I'm going to cut 2 squares. When cutting this sort of stuff, you can't just cut a square out. Because what you do is you cut it like you cut glass. You make a deep score mark, you snap it on the score, and then from that smaller piece, you cut out your squares. So, I'm going to add a lot of pressure because I'm working on a really cruddy cutting surface. And push down really hard with my utility knife. Sometimes you have to go back over that again, but if you've done it right, after the first time, the pressure,
it snaps apart. Cool, huh? So now I'll go through and do the same thing to cut out my squares. Once your squares are cut out of your plastic, you'll probably want some extra squares just to practice with. You'll need a form to heat form them too. Typically this is done with wood or metal. In our case we're using cardboard. But you might say, hey, cardboard, won't that catch fire? It shouldn't if you're heating it to the right temperature, because the temperature you want to heat your plastic to is around 280, 350 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas this stuff catches fire at about 451. So to make the heat form, I've got a piece of scrap cardboard folded in half, folded in thirds, and I'll just put some duct tape at the bottom. Then I've cut the same shape into a piece of folded cardboard, and I'll rest that on the top. Let's go outside to where there's concrete, bring our fire extinguisher, and shape our plastic.
So now I'm going to take one of my squares, pull off the plastic membrane, and place it onto my cardboard apparatus. Notice that the hole in the center is the size of the eye I want. What I'll do is I'll take a wooden dowel or something similar, like that wood knob, and I'll press it into the softened plastic to make it sink into the hole. I'm using a little butane torch, but you could also use a heat gun for this application. Notice how the plastic warps the moment the heat is applied to it. What we're looking for is for it to arch up and then to slump down, and the moment it slumps down, place the dowel into the hole and shape the plastic. I also have a spritzer bottle of water. That way, if the plastic melts too much or starts to sink or slump in a way I don't like, I can quickly cool it using the water. Alright, there we go. It's starting to slump. There we go. Now, I'm using a little sheet of plastic, so the edge there buckles up, but a larger sheet wouldn't have that problem. And I've got my dome. So what happens if I heat it a little too much or for a little longer? I'll put down the piece of still hot plastic and apply more flame. Okay, and boom, it starts bubbling and gets really flexible and soft. Let me show you that up close. Here's a close-up of a lens that's been intentionally overheated. See all those bubbles? After it starts bubbling, a couple seconds later it'll start scorching and even burning. Once you see the bubbles, you know that you've already made it too hot and it's time to stop.
To cut your lenses out of the surrounding plastic, you can either score off large parts, and then smaller parts, and then smaller parts to approximate a curve, or if you're using thin stuff like I am, you can actually just cut the curve out of the plastic. Make sure you leave some grab room on the edges of your lenses so that you can glue them into the eye sockets of your mask. Next, I'll show you how to paint the lenses in order to make them look really eye-like. So I've done a rough sketch of how I want my eye to look, and I've labeled each color as a layer. The stuff I want to show up very clearly and without any details hidden is labeled as the first layer, then second, then third. Otherwise, each paint layer obscures the layer that comes behind it. So what I've done is I've taken the acrylic I'm going to paint and put a little circle cut out of masking tape to blot out the pupil. I want the pupil clear so the actor can see out of it. So I'll start out with my little black dots. I can go through and wipe away any paint I don't like there. And next I'll add my layer of brown. Now obviously I'm not using a very fine brush for this, I'm just doing this quick, but if I wanted to, I could do really, really detailed work on here. Maybe I'll add some brown around the edges of the pupil too. Before I put the yellow layer on, I'll let the other paint dry. If I don't let the paint layer dry before I add more on top of it, I'll just smear around the wet paint. So we'll come back to this in a minute. Now that the other layers have dried, I'm going to go in and add my yellow. I'm painting further around than the edge of my eye because I don't want there to be any clear spots showing through when I mount this into the mask. Okay, got a little more thick yellow around here. So then I'll let it dry and peel off my pupil there in the center. For an added illusion of depth, I've also painted on the front side of the acrylic, the side that we had left unpainted previously. And so here's the finished eye. To give it a little extra brightness, I painted a coat of white paint over the other layers on the back. The lens is just hot glued and sealed to the flat part we painted the iris on. That's going to look really great, isn't it? For making structures on the mask, I use polymer clays. Polymer clays are a sort of clay that has some plastics in it, and when you bake them in the oven, the chemicals actually vaporize and leave the clay, leaving it hard after those softener chemicals are out of the clay body. There's different brands. One brand is Sculpting, and Sculpey is sold as Sculpey, Sculpey 2, Primo. There's also Fimo, which is another common brand that's sold in the US and abroad. These clays are very easy to work with and they're inexpensive. For a single brick, it will cost about $2.29. And for a large brick like this, it'll cost about $15, which is a little cheaper bulk if you intend to do a lot of projects. You can paint the clay, but your best option is to work directly with the colors you want. I'm going to be comparing translucent Sculpey clay to pearl Sculpey clay, so you can see the difference in the finished piece. One of the reasons I chose pearlescent Sculpey for this demonstration is that the other solid colored Sculpeys come out of the oven looking the way they did in the package. The pearlescent becomes a little bit less white, and also anywhere where the clay has been folded and then rolled onto itself, you'll see a little gray line. Well, that may not bother some people. Some folks who expected it to be perfectly white and pearly would find this to be a problem. Here you can see light shining through the translucent Sculpey. It gives a really nice natural effect. Let's look at the translucent Sculpey when it's not in bright light. Here you can see the appearance of the translucent Sculpey without bright light shining through it. See the flaking effects deep within the Sculpey? Inside the clay body, it sort of forms these refractions and shapes. You won't get that effect if you're using a solid color or a pearlescent Sculpey. When selecting paint to tint your fur or your foam, it can be confusing. There's a lot of different varieties out there. What you're looking for is acrylic paint. Acrylic paint is a plastic-based paint that doesn't give off any odors, is easy to clean up, and really binds well to foam and fake fur. Other options include polyurethane paints, enamel paints, watercolors, oil colors. You don't want to use any of those paints because they're not going to come out well. I'm showing you the bargain basement acrylic paints. You can also buy them in tubes for beginning artists, such as Basics or Liquitex brand. So here's a close-up look at some Sculpey clay. The instructions for baking are written right on the side of the package. Don't deviate from those instructions. You will be sorry if you do. The only time you're going to want to bake them differently than what the instructions say is if you're using a very small amount. A very thin layer of polymer clay will only need to be in the oven for a short time and probably at a lower temperature. You'll see that they have code numbers and names on the clay. That's actually really useful so that you don't end up buying white and then when you go to buy more clay, buy ivory and find that your teeth are all different colors. So here's how to use the clay. Break off an amount roughly sized to what you're going to need for your final piece. And then begin slowly squishing it and warming it in your hands. If you just try to sculpt it from here, it'll crack and it won't behave like clay. You need to warm it up and soften it. So I'm just warming it in my hands, and I'll do that for maybe a minute or two before I start working with it. So I've played with the clay for about 4 minutes, and now it's very soft. See how I can move it and shape it, but it's not cracking? Now here's a question you ought to be asking. If the clay softens when it gets hot, how on earth does it keep its shape in the oven? Well, it only softens so much, but it does soften enough to be a problem. If you have a shape like this, it will probably hold its shape in the oven. But if you have a shape like this, that's going to droop and fall until it's about like that on the tray, and then your final piece will look flat. So keep the fact that the Sculpey is going to droop a little bit when it's in the oven in mind when you make your shapes. So here I've made a rough nose shape to talk about texturing. You can texture in a lot of ways. You can impress details, such as using my incredibly festive toothpick, and just go through and draw a scale pattern onto the nose. I could also stipple and add dots. I could make an additive pattern where I press tiny balls of clay onto the surface of the nose. Whenever you do anything additive to a hunk of clay, especially polymer clay, you want to make sure you've got a very firm grip between the clay base you're adding this stuff to and the stuff you're adding. If it's just loosely touching the clay now, after it bakes it will still just be loosely touching the clay. When you put this stuff in the oven, it softens a little, but it doesn't get sticky and merged together like plastics, earthenware, or stoneware clay does. So if you want to have an addition on your nose, like say, I don't know, a big wart, you can do it a couple ways. You can either pinch up a little clay here, pinch up a little clay here, and really work them together so they stick really closely. Or you can texture where the wart is going to go, texture the back of the wart, bake them separately, and then after baking, glue them together at the little holes for your glue. Another way to add texture is to find something with a texture you find interesting in your environment and just impress it like that. You could get a really cool nose pattern by taking a bit of netting that, say, some onions or potatoes came in, or a doily even, and pushing it over the surface of the clay. And now we can go from another angle to get a neat diamond pattern. Now see, that would make a really neat nose. I might do it that way, actually. So I'm going to go through and sculpt my nose and then come back to this. If you want to carve this kind of clay, you can buy it harder for carving, but the easiest thing to do, rather than buying a more firm kind of Sculpey or Fimo, is just take it and stick it in the refrigerator for a few minutes till it's hard again, like it was when you first took it out of the package. Then you can go through with any kind of tool and just carve away the details. In the back of the nose, I've added a little bit of folding of the clay for texture. These edges are going to grip to the hot glue, and when the hot glue cools, help hold the nose to the mask. If you don't have any grip holds, there's nothing to prevent the surface of the clay from peeling away. The smaller the clay you're adhering to the mask, such as a tooth, the more important a grip or a hold is. Now that I've sculpted my nose, I'm going to place the oven-baked Sculpey, the raw soft Sculpey, on the nose of my piece and see how it fits. Well, that looks good. It's what I'm going for. I want a cartoony nose because he's a cartoon character. But now I need to make sure it holds this shape in the oven. If I just lay it flat, it will end up looking like this on the nose, and that's just not what I'm looking for. So what I'll do is I'll take a mound of tin foil, but not any tin foil that's already been used. Recycle, it's good for the earth, people. And so I'm reusing this tin foil, making a mound about the same shape, because I know the tin foil won't change shape in the oven, though the clay will a little. And then, see how that looks. That's perfect. That's just the right shape. So now I can bake the tin foil, and I can bake the nose in the oven. You can also bake paper or cardboard, as long as your oven has a reliable thermostat, and you pay attention to it, because the clay bakes at a lower temperature than paper or cardboard burns. So I'll go put him in the oven. So here you can see the effect of several coats of nail lacquer on foam. In bright light, it's easy to see the wet effect given by the lacquer to the foam. So while I'm baking the nose in a little tiny toastery type oven, I'm also looking up how I'm going to do my teeth. When you're doing research, go to the source. Try to find a photo of what you're going to base your design off of. In this case, I looked up veterinary dentistry, like dog toothbrushes and dog teeth cleaning, and found a really great image on Purdue's website that I can work with. Look at that, isn't that great? Even the texture on the roof of the mouth. So look for images like this when you're trying to do your research. And then grab a pen and some scrap paper. For me, I'm using old printer paper that's been printed on one side, and it's no longer useful. And I'll just go through and sketch the teeth out. So while it's baking, let's do some sketching. So I look at my mask and I think, here's the space I have to work with. How many teeth do I want? How big should they be? Then I look at my resource photo, and then I do a sketch. Just flatten out what I think the jaw looks like. The reason I've done the nose and the teeth separately is I'm using the pearlescent Sculpey. It has a nice sheen to it, and that nice sheen is also slowly spreading over my fingertips. If I handled the black Sculpey after this, it would have the glitter from the pearlescent Sculpey in it. Normally I wouldn't have to do the Sculpey parts separately. So I've got my softened lump, and you'll see I'm working over clean paper. This stuff will pick up anything it touches off my hands, off my work surface. So, unlike the black, where dust would be hidden, you'll be able to see any sort of impurities on the white clay. So I'm making sure I'm using my the back side of my printer paper, and I washed my hands before I started. Alright, so once I've got a loose shape for my fang, I'll need to add a glue hold for it. So I'm definitely adding some texture in here, and this will be the side that touches the mask. So fang number 1 is done, and now I'll go through and make each tooth based on my sketches. So I've gone from my photo to my sketch to my about to be baked teeth. You'll notice each tooth has a little grab for the hot glue. Your oven may produce a lot of heat from the elements that burns the outside of the clay, even though the oven is at the right temperature, because the clay surface is getting direct heat from your elements. If that's the case, Make a little tent out of tin foil. Again, you reuse your tin foil if you can. And that tent will keep the direct heat from hitting the surface of the teeth, so you won't get that nasty burn. Here's to show you how Sculpey should normally look, similar to the color it was when it came out of the package, and what happens if you overcook the Sculpey. Once the Sculpey gets overcooked, it starts to get poofy. These were initially the same thickness, and you can see it's poofed out. It's like a sponge on the inside. Also, it discolors on the surface, getting brown. The brown will eventually turn to black, and it will start smoking and create this really nasty black bubbly crust. To avoid overcooking the Sculpey, make sure you know your oven. In this case, this was cooked outside of an element, and this was cooked directly under a heating element. So obviously this one got burned. Follow the directions. It may seem like when the Sculpey comes out of the oven that it's really soft. That doesn't mean it's not cooked. It will be soft until it cools completely, and it will also be more brittle. When I pulled the nose out of the oven, I dropped it. And see how it's cracked along one side? Now that the Sculpey's cooled, that's not going to happen. But when it first comes out of the oven, it's a little softer. So, if I were doing a movie project, I'd probably remake this, but, this is an example, so I'm just going to hot glue it. I've gone through and painted the mesh. That'll still be exposed when the nose is attached. And now I've got to make some stylistic choices. When the nose is on, do I want the fur in the back sticking up against it? Do I want it laying flush and flat like that? Do I want the fur sticking out? Do I want it to hold the fur in a certain direction? You can see that little changes like that can really alter the look of the mask. So, make your choices carefully. So I'm going to decide how I want it and glue on the nose. So now I have to decide some other stuff. Do I want the nose to be matte like it is now, or shiny and wet? I'm going to add some Mod Podge clear acrylic coat to it. You can buy clear acrylic paint if you don't mind the stench and having to do several coats. You could use nail lacquer. And I'm just applying with my finger. I could go through with a brush if I wanted to, but I like this. And this stuff will dry to a clear plastic finish that's got some shine to it and make it look like he's got nasty wet nostrils. And I'm going to take that wetness down and put it on the foam. And the foam will start sucking up some of this stuff, so it may take a coat or two. We'll see. If I put it on thick enough, it'll be fine. And that'll give a really nice effect of a wet, nasty nose. In fact, I think I might do that around the edge of the lips too. So, you can see where it's thinnest, it's drying really quickly and giving me that clear finish I want. I don't need a thick layer of Mod Podge or other acrylic clear coat to get a shiny effect. In fact, I think I may just go in and apply some around the eyes too to make it look like there's tears. But that's how you make a nose out of Sculpey. So here you can see the effect of several coats of nail lacquer on foam. In bright light, it's easy to see the wet effect given by the lacquer to the foam. I've begun attaching teeth, which is a very simple process. You dab on the hot glue and stick on the tooth, but I wanted to explain how I was dealing with the split in the lip. I've cut a little piece of foam out, smooth the edge. You can see that that's an angled cut there. And I'm going to glue that into place as a gum on the inside of the lip and glue the teeth onto this piece of foam. That's a mouthful of love, isn't it? Alright, now for the bottom jaw. So, I'll show you the attachment process. I said it was simple, but I should probably show you. Just add a dab of hot glue, Position your tooth. And hold. This doesn't give you the world's best grip though. If you knock them hard, they will pop off. Even with the hold spots on the tooth for the glue, it still doesn't have the same grip as something porous, such as another piece of foam would to the lip. If you're making foam teeth, power to you, those things are not going to come out of the mouth, and they'll survive a lot of trouble too. There are better ways to insert these. For example, I could buy very thin foam, the couple millimeter stuff, and I could line the inside with an inner lip or an inner gum line to hold them in place. I could poke a hole in the tooth and wire it in. There's a lot of different options. So I'll go through and finish the lower jaw. For the tongue, as with the nose, you have some choices. I made the nose out of Sculpting, but I could have also made the nose out of foam. In this case, I'm making the tongue out of heat-formed foam, but I could also make it out of Sculpting. I described heat forming in the chapter on foam, so I'm going to take this and heat form it, like I did with the other pieces of foam, into a shape like this, where this will go into the back of the jaw, and this will be the tip of the tongue. So I've heat formed my tongue, and I'm not going to do a whole lot of painting or texturing, but I've got this example from another mask to show you how applying a clear coat over the top can give it a nice wet appearance, and that you can stamp texture into the foam by, in this case I used the back of a pen and just beat up the tongue and then scratched a groove into the center before heat forming it. What I'll do with this is I'll just dab on paint so that the edges blend in with the inside of the jaw. So I'll get out my paint and do that now. So I've got my very cheap acrylic paints, and I'm using two colors. I'm using the black for the darkest areas and the brown for where the darkest areas meet the red to help give it a better fade. The foam's still a little wet from the thermoforming, so it'll take extra long for the paint to dry. Notice though that the foam sucks up the paint. This can be a problem if you have black foam and you want to make a white tooth out of it, because you could do your teeth out of foam too. You'll have to use several coats. I love the acrylic paint on the foam because it's got bend to it. Acrylic paints and latex paints will both bend with your piece, so if the mask gets busted, the paint will bend with the foam surface rather than crackle and peel off. Okay, I'm going to do the bottom of the tongue too, just in case you get a weird angle and you can look under the tongue, it'll look shaded. And now I'll go in and blend those areas with the brown. With the tubes, say I was using an acrylic tube of black, you can just leave the tube as is and it's always ready to use, but with these little bottles, you have to shake them all the time, every time you use them. And I like the really sudden gradient from dark to light because it makes it look like the jaw is very deep and jumping out at you. Okay, and now I leave this sit until it's dry. So now it's time to assemble the teeth and the tongue. To get the tongue to sit at the height I want, what I'll do is, rather than gluing the sides of the jaw to the tongue, which are liable to pull off as the actor speaks, I'm just going to glue a little arch into the bottom made of foam, and then glue the tongue onto that. You can see on the side there I've got my teeth all arranged. I didn't feel like waiting till they were cool before I began working with them and gluing them in place, so I dunked them in a cup of cold water. And then they cooled until they were nice and solid, so I won't have any of the problems with breaking like I did with the nose when I dropped it right out of the oven. Okay. I'm using a lot of glue there to maximize the contact between the glue and the foam surface, since I've got two curved surfaces touching. Alright, and now I hold that until it's cool. For this werewolf mask, I purchased a latex ear from a costume store, and then I painted it to add depth, glued on a little fur to make it match the mask. And that was that. You can buy lots of ears from costume stores. There's a variety. There's ape-type ears, elf ears, and they usually come in a solid color from cast latex. And because it's latex, you can paint on it with a latex or acrylic paint, and the paint sticks really well. As you can see, it's hard to scrape off or remove from the ear.
So, this is the finished mask, and as you can see, the jaw action is great. This would be perfect for voiceover for a film, or live stage action, where you're just going to have your actor project his voice a little more. In terms of improving this, the edges of the flaps are left unfinished, so you'd want to hot glue those over, or hide the unfinished edges. And you definitely want a flat for the top of the head and the back of the head. And you can do that with just a square of fabric tucked in around the sides. I think that this mask is just a little bit too thin. I would want to add flaps to the side, maybe a little padding, to give it a wolfish look, more so than it is now.